Good evening, everybody. My name is Verity James, and hello and welcome to our important conversation, our discussion tonight on better managing our lives within this climate, and also seeing what we can do as individuals and as a collective to better manage this earth on whom we depend. Our commissioners, by the way, Professor Tim Flannery, Professor Leslie Hughes, and Professor Will Stephan. There are a couple more, but we've lost them along the way. Tim's going to tell you about that very soon. Before we go any further, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome to the stage for a welcome to country. Will you please make her welcome, Ingrid Cummings, who's a Whadjuk Noongar woman. Please make her welcome.
That's the first time I've got a woot. I'm very excited now. Good evening, my name is Ingrid Cumming from the Collard Bennell Shaw families. I'm a traditional owner and custodian of the country that we all gather here today, the Whadjuk Noongar country. There are 14 different dialects in Noongar country, and I'm representative of the Whadjuk and the Bibliman and the Willaman. I'm here on behalf of my ancestors past and present to welcome you to country in a woman's way, and that's through song. Now, if tonight is going to be filled with discussion, we will need to warm the audience up, I would think. So I have a 4-year-old who also likes to steal my clapsticks. So what I'm going to ask is that we have some audience participation while I sing to you on country. And understanding there's not many Noongar linguists in the room, what I'm singing is Yaukul Kwapara Wiran, Wurukul Wara Wiran, which is bring in the good spirit and take away the bad, because we want the good spirits to come and to look over all of you for safe travels throughout our country, as was a traditional practice for thousands of years here in Noongar country. So, without further ado, I'll give you the beat, you can follow along with me. Kaya Kwapara Wiran, Yauku Kwapara Wiran, Yauku Kwapara Wiran, Jananing Yiranana, Maman Yoga Kulinga, Maman Yoga Kulinga, Jananing Yiranana, Nichan Yunga Puja, Kwapara Yunga Puja, Maya Maya Ngang Mutang, Maya Maya Ngang Bridia, Maya Maya Ngang Kulinga, Wanju Nichan Yunga Puja, Wanju Nichan Yunga Puja, Thank you very much. Australia's Got Talent, here I come. The last part of the proceedings is to pass on the Burrawanking. Now, traditional practice here in Whadjuk Noongar country is when Wom or strangers or new people would come to our lands, we would meet them and we would pass on this Burrawanking. So when you travel overseas, one of the first things you do is go to customs and put your passport down and state your intentions in country. So that's basically the same form of practice here in Noongar country traditionally. So what I will do is pick one of the Bridias or the bosses that are here tonight as part of this proceedings. I'll ask Professor Tim Flannery to come and accept this message stick on behalf of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and we want to welcome him and the rest of his esteemed colleagues to Whadjuk Noongar country.
Thank you, that's lovely. Oh, thank you so much. Great, thank you.
Now, if you want to just hold that message stick up, what we've got there is the red representing the Kala or the fire, the black dots representing the people, to pertain to a stereotype, but never mind. And the two blue squiggly lines shows that we are in Whadjuk Noongar country, which is the people that live between the Warradan, the ocean, or the Bilia and the river. So enjoy that.
Thank you.
And
lovely.
safe travels throughout my country.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. That was spectacular. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you to Ingrid, but thank you to you, as I mentioned, for coming out today. It shows you care enough about the changes in climate, and I know that we're going to have a constructive conversation here tonight. I already know that you're intelligent. That's right, isn't it? And what's more, not just intelligent, but also civil. I know that that is very true, and because how could you be other in a library that is so beautiful like this, that is so in tune with nature? This is the most extraordinary building. Even when you go to have a wee, it practically does it for you. Honest to God, it's fantastic. I just keep wanting to go back. But it is a fantastic place, so well done to the organisers for creating such an ambience and such a wonderful in tune with nature. Surely that's a sign of the future too. So, what we're going to do is we're going to have a few little presentations and then we're going to open it up to you. So, this is the critical decade. This is the time when we need to not just make decisions, but make the right decisions. So, let's start the process now of finding out how we can do that too. Let's turn to our independent panellists now, who are our climate commissioners. No, commissioners. In fact, I'll just introduce Professor Flannery, the Chief Climate Commissioner, who will introduce the other commissioners. So, amongst the huge list of things he does, he's one of Australia's leading writers on climate change, an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer and conservationist. He was also named Australian of the Year in 2007. Professor Flannery has held all sorts of academic positions, including Professor at the University of Adelaide, Director of the South Australian Museum in Adelaide, Principal Research Scientist at the Australian Museum, Visiting Chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. Does my head in every night. Tim is also the current Panasonic Professor of Environmental Sustainability at Macquarie University. Will you please make him extremely welcome? Tim.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Verity, for that great introduction, and thank you all for being here this evening. And incidentally, Verity, you solved a mystery for me. When I used the toilets here, I wondered where that hand came from that did up my fly, but it's obviously the building does it all for you. Remarkable. But it is a fantastic building, and I think one of the great things about this building is that it represents the will of the people. I was speaking to the Mayor of Mosman Park earlier on, who told me that there was various alternatives out there, but this very sustainable building with its photovoltaics and wind turbines and all the rest was actually what you wanted, and that is fantastic. So I feel very privileged to be in a building like this evening speaking to you, so thank you for that. I'm just going to take a few minutes to explain what the Climate Commission does and introduce the commissioners. Then I want to turn over to you, because this is your evening really, and your chance to ask questions of the experts we have here, which is a pretty special opportunity, so I don't want to take too long. Look, the Climate Commission was set up as a result of a promise by the federal government following the last election. We're an independent commission, so the minister can't direct us to do things. We're a bit like the judiciary or the Reserve Bank Board in that we don't take direction from the government. But we are briefed to do three things really, to get out among the Australian public and raise awareness of climate science, of economic aspects relating to how we address climate change, and what is happening elsewhere in the world. They're our three jobs. We don't provide opinions on policy, either government or opposition policy, because you can get that every day of the week in the newspapers anyway. And we quite deliberately gave away the power to do that so that we would gain the authority of being seen as a truly independent source of information, because that's our role. We are not interested just in the short term. We understand that the climate issue is going to be with us for many decades, and that unless we have an Australian population that is well versed with the matters that we're going to have to deal with, we are likely to make poor decisions. So by the time these young people in the front row here are my age, we're still going to be debating climate change. There'll be different options on the table, and it's very important that the community as a whole has the right sort of information, I think, on which to base rational decisions. We produce several things as a Climate Commission. We have a website you can go to and have a look at all of the other events we've done and look at our other products. We do meetings like this, and typically when we come to an area, we'll meet, the great and good, maybe your local member or mayor or whatever else. Then we might have a business breakfast with local businesses. We may then go out to an industry site and visit an industry. Quite often, quite a large emitting industry, might be an aluminium smelter or a refiner or whatever. Then meet other community leaders, and then have a town hall meeting like this. So we get a bit of a flavour of what's going on around the country by doing that, having a bit of an in-depth look at the regions. And I'll talk a bit later about some of the things we discover. The other thing we do is provide reports, and our reports are very important to us. We hope that they're an authoritative and widely accepted source of information. The first report we published was a product by Professor Stefan here. It was called The Critical Decade, and you have a small extract of it on your seats there, dealing with impacts for southwest of Western Australia. But that report was delivered to the Federal Parliament in May this year and was accepted by both sides of politics. So both Labor and Liberal endorsed that report as the factual basis on which we will make decisions about climate change. And that sort of approach is tremendously important to us. Bipartisan support is very important when it comes to these issues. We need to be seen to reflect the very best and most authoritative science, so we don't stray from that particular brief. Having said that, I'm going to turn over to our commissioners. We have Will Stefan here, who is really a world authority on climate modelling and the world climate system, and Professor Leslie Hughes, who is a world authority on adapting to climate change, as well as the impacts of climate change on biodiversity. There's a few commissioners who can't be here this evening. One, Jerry Houston, was the chair of BP Australasia for several years and has 34 years experience in the oil and gas industry. I was really hoping he'd be with us, but he is stuck in New Zealand at the moment. A blizzard has hit Queenstown, and I think he's trying to drink his way out of it with a bit of good Pinot Noir and a Sauvignon Blanc. But anyway, he can't be with us. Roger Beale, another of our commissioners who's a very eminent economist, is in the UK at the moment and was last heard of in the East India Club with a gin and tonic in his hands. And Susanna Elliott, who was with us today, is, I think, currently drinking her way back to Adelaide from Qantas. But I don't know what that says about the pressures of the job we do, but occasionally we do pick up a glass and have a bit of fun. But anyway, having said that, I'd like to turn over now to Will, who will provide a brief overview of the critical decade. Thank you.
Right. Thanks very much, Tim. We want to get on to your questions as soon as possible, but we get a lot of questions about climate science and climate impacts. So Leslie and I are going to give you a quick Climate Change 101, just so that we're all starting on the same basis. So let's see if we can get to the first one. Yeah, okay. This is air temperature record. That's sort of the iconic climate change graph that we all show. From 1880 to 2010, you see a couple of things there. You see a lot of variability year to year. It's a jagged line. Not every year is warmer than the year before. Even you see periods of a decade where it doesn't seem like much is happening. But look, since the middle of last century, the trend is clear. The air temperature is going up. Even more important for scientists is the ocean, because that's where most of the extra heat actually goes, not into the air. And you see there too, the ocean temperature is rising from 1950 to 2010. And particularly the last decade, when some said global warming has stopped. No, it hasn't. The ocean is still warming, and that's where most of the heat is going. And we can see that ice is being lost too. That red jagged line represents the rate of loss of the Arctic sea ice. This is ice which floats on the ocean over the North Pole up in the northern hemisphere. And you see it's being lost at a rapid rate. Interestingly, the black line, which goes out to 2100, is obviously not observations because it hasn't happened yet. That's a model projection, a climate model projecting what should happen to that Arctic sea ice. And you see the model is a bit too conservative. It isn't picking up the rate at which that's actually being lost. So one thing we can say is the Earth is warming. And of course, people say, why is it warming? Is it natural variability, or do we humans have something to do with it? Well, the answer to that's actually been known for a couple of decades, and it isn't debated anymore in the scientific community. You can't go to the scientific literature and see a debate on the issue of whether the greenhouse effect is really behind this or not. The greenhouse effect has been known since the 1850s. It's been known a very long time. It's basic physics. You learned it in first-year physics courses. The sun provides the energy to warm the Earth's surface. But if the Earth didn't give energy back out, the Earth would continually warm up until it burnt up. And it's been around for 4.6 billion years, so it hasn't burnt up. So what the Earth does is it gets energy at a certain wavelength. It's light that we see in daytime, and it's the even shorter wavelength energy that burns our skin when we go down to the beach just down the road there. But the Earth gives back the energy in a different wavelength. It gives it back as heat. Now, that's important because the greenhouse gases that circle the Earth let all the light and ultraviolet radiation come in, but they absorb some of the heat that goes out and trap it at the Earth's surface and the lower atmosphere. And that's what warms the Earth's surface. And that's a natural effect. It's a good thing it's there because the Earth would be frozen if it wasn't there. So if we add extra greenhouse gases, and we are, the Earth should warm, and it is. So this isn't debated at all in the reputable scientific community. Let me show you just one way we test this. Here's a graph. I haven't shown you the graph yet, but it goes from 1900 to 2000. And what we're going to do is take a climate model and say, let's give it the factors that control natural variability, changes in incoming sunlight and volcanoes. We do that. And that's what should have happened last century to temperature. It does vary. It goes up and down naturally. And that's what it should have looked like. But now we know that extra greenhouse gases have gone into the atmosphere. We've been burning fossil fuels, most of it since 1950. So we put that in the model. And that's what the temperature should do. Notice that there's not much difference until 1950. But after 1950, the two lines diverge. Now we can test our understanding of climate change, of the climate system. So that's already happened. We have observations. We've sent out our Bureau of Meteorology scientists to gather the temperature data, and that's what it looks like. So when you look at the actual data, it fits very well the line where you include the greenhouse gases, the greenhouse gas increases. But it doesn't fit the line where it's only natural variability. I could spend the next hour with more evidence that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are the primary reason we've seen the warming, but I don't want to bore you with all of that. I want to leave you with one more slide before I'm going to let Leslie talk to you about what this means for Western Australia. And just give you one reason why this is important. This bell-shaped curve shows you a range of temperatures you might get under a certain climate, and where that peaks is what we call the average. So the average summertime temperature here may be 27 degrees or something like that. But you get really hot days and you get some cool days too. Now, a 1 degree temperature shift doesn't sound like much in the average, but watch what happens when you apply that. You get a big change out of that so-called tail. You get much more hot weather, many more days above 35, and you get some hot weather you never saw before, record hot weather. That happened to Melbourne in 2009, 46.4 degrees, absolutely record high temperature. It is extremely unlikely, astronomically small probability, that that would have occurred without an underlying trend in temperature. And our infrastructure, like this urban rail system, is designed for that old grey line. It's designed for that range. It's not designed for the new climate in red. And so that's why it fell over in Melbourne. The tracks buckled and the system couldn't work. Same thing with human health. We're not designed for temperatures like that. They had about 250 excess deaths in Melbourne during the time temperatures went up to 44, 45 degrees. So that's an example of impacts, and now bringing it right back to this area, Leslie's going to tell you a little bit about Western Australia.
Thanks. Next one. You know, if climate change wasn't going to have impacts, we wouldn't really care very much about it. It would just be a few boffins in laboratories fiddling around with their computers. But why we should care about climate change is that it actually has impacts. And indeed, here, especially in Western Australia, we are already seeing some of those impacts. So, the temperature in Western Australia has gone up about 0.8 of a degree over the last 100 years. And that doesn't sound like very much, but as Will said, 0.8 of a degree means a lot more hot temperatures at the hot end. The rainfall has been declining. Rainfall in southwest Western Australia started to decline very abruptly in about 1975, and since then there's been a 15% drop in rainfall. And that doesn't sound like all that much either, but what that translates into, because of the nature of the catchment here, it translates into about a 40% decline in the runoff. So there's been a 40% reduction in stream flow into the Perth water supply. I should point out, though, before I move on, is that the green areas of the map are where there has been more rainfall. So overall, Western Australia's been getting wetter, but that rainfall is really occurring up in the northwest region, whereas the southwest has been getting drier. As I said, this has had major implications for the Perth water supply, and that's why you've got a desal plant and another one on the way.
The top graph there shows the bars are the stream flow into the Perth water supply each year, and those horizontal lines are the averages over particular time periods. So the red line there shows an average of about 177 gigalitres per year flowing in between 1975 and the year 2000. Then the sort of purpley line, the next one, nearly 60 gigalitres per year between 2006, 2010. 2010 itself was a very, very dry year. Only 13 gigalitres flowed in during that year. My area of specialty is impacts of climate change on biodiversity, and here in the southwest you have some very, very special biodiversity. In fact, southwest Western Australia is recognised as one of the global hotspots internationally. So you have a lot to lose. You have already lost quite a bit. 75% of your environment has been cleared of native vegetation, so biodiversity here is already under stress, even without the additional stress of climate change. You have many, many species that are very rare, threatened, occur nowhere else, and have very, very small ranges, and that predisposes them to additional risk as the climate changes rapidly. You also have some fantastic marine ecosystems. The Ningaloo Reef, which brings in about $130 million each year from the 200,000 visitors that come, bleached for the first time ever in 2006. It bleached again in February this year, and about 20% of the reef was affected. The long-term impacts of that, of course, we don't know yet. So the bleaching here is a little bit behind the Great Barrier Reef, which started to bleach in about the late 1970s, but Ningaloo Reef has started to feel the effects of an increased sea surface temperature, which has increased by between about 0.6 and nearly a degree over the last few decades. Sea levels are rising, and that's another reason why Western Australia is a bit special, unfortunately. Global sea levels have been rising at about 3.2 millimetres a year since the 90s. In Western Australia, it's over 7 millimetres a year, so it's rising at over twice the global average in Western Australia. And of course, that puts at risk, in combined with flooding events in estuaries, that puts at risk coastal infrastructure, buildings, sandy beaches, roads and rail and things like that. Okay, we called our report the critical decade because of what is shown on this graph. What the graph shows over the little wiggly black line is the rising temperature, similar to the graph that Will showed at the beginning. And then the blue and the red areas basically show two different futures that we might have on this planet. The more optimistic future is the blue future, showing that if we abate our greenhouse gas emissions pretty seriously, we may be able to keep our temperatures to below the 2-degree level above pre-industrial temperatures that's generally considered to be the point at above which we start to get some really dangerous impacts. So that's the blue area. The red area is what we call the business as usual scenario. If we keep emitting greenhouse gases at the current rate, which is accelerating, that's the sort of future we might be looking at. Now, scientists like Will and I work with graphs all the time. We love graphs, but we understand that lots of people, kind of tune out when they see a graph, so I want to make this a little bit more personal. So this is how. Okay, so I was born in the 1960s, and assuming I live till I'm about 85, that bar there shows the average mean annual temperature that I will experience over my lifetime. Now, I've got 2 teenage kids born in the mid-90s, and assuming that they live to about the same age, that's the average temperature that they will experience over their lifetime under a business as usual scenario. Now, I don't have grandchildren yet, but assuming I might get some someday, and if they're born when my children are about 30 and they live till they're 85, that's the mean annual temperature that they will experience over their lifetime. So really what we're talking about here is my grandkids and your grandkids and potentially our great-grandkids. And really what we've got to do is that. It's bring our greenhouse gases down so that our future generations inherit a world from us. It'll still be hotter than it is today and will remain much hotter for a long time, but hopefully it will be livable. Okay, I'm going to hand back over now to Tim to talk about that last slide,
Great.
which is some positive things. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much, Leslie. I just want to briefly mention that as we travel around Australia, and this would be our now 10th or 11th regional visit now, we find that people are particularly interested in opportunities that arise from addressing climate change. So it's not all, we don't always hear about concerns for negative impacts, but for opportunities. And we were in Bunbury this morning and had a business breakfast down there, and some really extraordinary examples came up of opportunities that are occurring down there among businesses as climate change is addressed. One of them concerned a couple of dairy farmers who were using the waste from their dairy farm to run a 1.4 megawatt electricity plant. And that's a very significant amount of electricity. It's enough for about, I think, 1,400 homes on average, or somewhere, it's a large number of homes. So for them to be developing an additional business on their farm, it was tremendously encouraging, I thought. Fantastic. And they were able to do that because of good legislation supported by both sides of politics, which is the mandated renewable energy target. Makes it possible for people like that to build additional businesses. We also met with the people working in what is Australia's most carbon-intensive business. And that's a company called Silcoa. It's Australia's only silicon smelter. I was anticipating them presenting us with some real pushback for dealing with climate change, but again it was opportunity that they saw. They have a very valuable waste heat stream, very, very high heats, 4,000 degrees Celsius that comes out at the end of their process. With the right incentives, they can afford to invest in using that heat for a number of different processes. They also use charcoal to reduce, to strip the oxygen out of their silicon. And that charcoal, of course, is biological carbon, and they're working now on sequestering the CO2 that comes from their process into the ground so that they will be effectively carbon negative, not just carbon neutral, but carbon negative. So those sort of examples from industry really, I think, give us all hope that there is an appetite, particularly in regional Australia, for grasping those opportunities. There's a tremendous number of innovative people out there, from small businesses to large ones, who see this as an opportunity. The people who still see it as a threat, quite often we find that they're not extremely well versed in what any approach may mean to their business. So there's a fear factor, fear of the unknown, tends to drive some of the fear. I mean, there will be a cost, and no one is denying that, but for some businesses at least, there are opportunities as well. So look, having said that, we're going to stop, turn over to you. We'd love to have your questions, and for the rest of the evening, it's your session. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Commissioners. So let me just run through the drill very quickly again so we're all on the same page. If you can put up your hand if you would like to ask a question, I will try to get to as many in the room as I possibly can. When the mic comes to you, and please do wait for the mic, you need to be prepared to say your name and to say where you're from. And also, the mic runner, will ask you to sign the release form so that we can use your question on the website. And I recognise your passion and your interest, but if you get out of line, I will evict you. Warmly, caringly, but I'll evict you, just so we know, so that we can keep the discussion going. And we're looking for brief questions, and our commissioners, though it's hard for them, will try to give you brief and concise answers. So let's play. Hands up. Who wants to ask a question?
My name's Penny Lee. I'm here from the Conservation Council of Western Australia and also as a private citizen. I'm a little bit disappointed that questions that we were asked to put in advance are apparently not available. It didn't occur to me that you wouldn't be using them. So
we will be, Penny, as well. It's just that we wanted to...
Tonight?
Yeah.
It's just that,
Yeah.
as far as I recall, we didn't receive an email back with the content of the question. So if you're like me and you can type straight into a box and then press a button, it disappeared. I have no idea what I asked. I'm sure it was well considered.
I'm sure it was too, Penny. Yeah, we had the questions
We have
here.
them all up here. We were saving them towards the end of the evening because we wanted to give people a chance who turned up here to have their say as well.
Thank you.
So.
This girl here, you had your hand up. Would you?
What do I have to start? I'm Gabby Marchand.
Would you stand, please?
I'm Gabby Marchand, and I'm from Webley Downs. And I'm just wondering, as a young person whose children will be affected by climate change, what can I do to try and ensure that action happens as quickly as possible?
Great question. Thank you very much for that. Going straight to the solutions. Tim?
Well, yeah, that's pretty quick, straight to the solutions, exactly. I think at the moment, what we need is real engagement by the Australian community on this issue, regardless of what where your stance is. If you have a well-informed and well-based opinion, and you can exhibit some active leadership, whether it's talking to your parents or at your workplace and discussing the electricity bill or whatever it is that allows you to get into the discussion. That's what's important now. I think we really do need that public engagement, because there's a lot of misinformation flying around the place, and there's very little leadership in the area, so every one of us that can be a leader is a great thing.
Towards the end of this evening, we are going to go through a number of ideas, possible solutions, things that you can do. Penny, thank you very much for your question. Penny, you need to give the microphone back now. I know what young people are like with microphones. Penny, was your question, I understand that China and India are both taking steps to mitigate carbon pollution in their countries? Is that your question? Let me help you out the rest of it. We all understand, however, that standards of living will continue to rise in these countries, fair enough, as they work with parity for Western countries. Given that, are there any scientific indications of when global growth in carbon pollution might begin to level out if current carbon abatement plans around the world are implemented by 2020? Thanks for the question, and thanks for letting me channel you. Right.
I can have a go at answering that. For 3 years I worked as chair of the Copenhagen Climate Council, and through part of that period we were engaged with the Obama administration and John Holdren, who is the advisor to the President on climate change. And he outlined really the strategy that lays behind the Copenhagen Accord, which was the agreement that was forged in Copenhagen at that meeting, which engaged most of the emitting nations, in fact almost all the large emitters and most of the nations. And the general strategy is that the developed countries should seek to turn their emissions curve downwards, in other words, start to reduce their emissions during this decade. And that's why we call our report the critical decade, because that is the critical first step to occur. If that happens, then there'll be enough headroom for the emissions of places like China and India, which are still strongly growing, to grow but peak the following decade, and then for the rest of the world to follow the decade after. So that's the general architecture that people are looking at.
But China and India are actually doing things, aren't they?
Doing a tremendous amount. Yep. But we can't expect their emissions to peak this decade. It'll be the decade after that this will happen. They're doing a tremendous amount, and their pledges are all there in the Copenhagen Accord. They're reducing emissions intensity very strongly, investing in renewables and so forth. So that's the general picture. Now, if you ask, are nations keeping to their pledges under the Copenhagen Accord, given it's not a legally binding document, these are pledges that countries put forward themselves, the answer is yes, they are. Even the United States, which has been gridlocked on this issue politically, has pledged a 17% reduction in emissions below 2005 levels by 2020, and they're on track to achieve that. Now, part of that is the economic slowdown, but part of it is good policy as well. They've been developing some very good policy, particularly in the transport area. Canada has the same targets, and again, without federal leadership in Canada, strong action by the provinces is seeing that target being delivered. China has delivered its target as well at some economic cost to itself. It ended up taking a small cut in economic growth to achieve its carbon targets. India has introduced a carbon tax, and Europe, of course, has been doing this for a number of years now and is well on track to meeting its commitments. In fact, Great Britain has recently increased its pledges under those agreements.
Great, thank you, Tim. Yes? Yes.
Hi, my name is Shona and I'm from Hilton and I'm running a catering business. And I just want to know, in your opinion, what is the most, in what industry in Australia can we make the most difference in terms of abating the amount of pollution and CO2 that's emitted? Which industry has the most sort of potential for reduction in CO2?
The one that has the most potential is electricity generation, because most of our electricity is generated using fossil fuels, using coal, some gas now. And that's the biggest emitter in any of the industries. Closely ranked as number 2 are transport and agriculture. Okay, but they're way behind electricity generation as the main one. So that's the big ticket item. If we can get that under control, we'll get emissions on the downward track. And can I say on behalf of the commissioners, they've never had a sandwich menu given to them before in the green room. The food is fabulous. It's all organic and biodynamic and comes from fair trade, free trade, and it's wonderful. Thank you. Other way. So here had a question, man in the maroon jumper. If we could get a microphone to you quickly, then that would be wonderful. We love the cheeses too, Shona.
Thank you. My name is Michael Johnson. I'm a local resident here. I'm after a bit of education for myself, really. In the last year, we've had 2 major eruptions from volcanoes. I assume that these volcanoes are dispensing carbon around the world. What interests me is what percentage that carbon relates to the percentage that is equitable to humans rather than to nature. And if these volcanoes are producing an enormous amount of carbon, what can we actually do about them?
Oh, what an interesting question, Michael. Thank you.
Okay.
For Will, Professor Will
yes,
Steffen.
Volcanoes emit, and the 2 that have erupted, the one in Iceland and I think the one in Chile, together emit less than 1% compared to the human emissions. So humans' emissions are 100 times greater than volcanoes, and that's true on average. But volcanoes do affect the climate, it's a good question, but they generally tend to cool the climate because their emissions are dominated by sulfur compounds rather than CO2, and the sulfur compounds scatter incoming light and tend to cool the climate. So one of the little dips I showed in my graph there was due to some volcanic eruptions.
Hi, my name's Tim Darby from South Fremantle. I've been reading quite a lot about economics lately, and it seems that everyone around the world in this current economic climate is looking to grow their way out of economic crises. I think they are hoping for between 2 and 3% annual growth minimum, but it would seem to me that 2 or 3% annual growth in economy necessarily precludes a decline in carbon emissions. Would you agree with that?
I'll perhaps take this one. I really wish that Roger Beale was here rather than sipping his gin and tonic at the East India Club at this moment.
Sorry, mate, I know
it's
you're
all
not
right. He's really a world authority on this area, but I have heard him answer similar questions before, and I think what Roger would say is that under any scenario for any carbon price, conceivable carbon price that we're discussing, economic growth will continue. Now, the rate of growth might decline very slightly, but economic growth will continue and prosperity will continue to grow. And that has been the experience in places like Germany as well, as they've taken on these quite significant targets and seen their economy grow. So I don't think there's a fear that addressing any pollution issue will drive the economy into bankruptcy or anything like that. I don't think there's any economic basis to suggest that. Of course, there are impacts and there is an undeniable cost, right? We can't deal with pollution problems without imposing a cost. Ever since the first village was settled and someone was throwing banana skins near the huts, someone actually had to get up and toss them into the local creek. That's a cost, right? So for every pollution problem we've ever dealt with, there's been a cost, and this one is no exception. But my understanding from the economists is it's not significant enough to impede growth or stop economic growth.
But the cost if we don't do something.
That's exactly right, and that's the other side of it, which I should have mentioned. Lord Stern's report suggests that the cost of doing nothing is actually, I think, about 5 times or 6 times greater than the cost of doing something. So we make these investments in order to avoid larger costs at a later date.
So?
Hello, I'm Paul Loring from Fremantle. Transport in WA actually accounts for about 20% of our energy use. So I'm interested in how we can switch buses, taxis, vans and HGVs to fossil-free energy. For example, is hydrogen a viable replacement for diesel and gas? And if so, is it viable to establish a solar-based business to create that hydrogen in places like our deserts in our northern areas? WA is reputed to have some of the best quality solar energy in those isolated desert areas.
Great question, Paul, and very interesting for Western Australia as well, because we're so far flung. It's not like Victoria, where everybody's next door in bed with anybody else.
Yeah, look, that's a really
I don't
good
know
question. I'm not sure whether you mentioned trains as an important part of the solution, but in fact, Perth is a good example of being ahead of the rest of the country in terms of revitalising its urban rail system. And that is the most efficient way to move people around. It's more efficient than buses and other types of vehicles. So the idea is to electrify as much of your ground transport as you can, promote active transport by bicycles and by foot, then using urban rail. And when you can't use urban rail, use electric vehicles. Now, that's an interesting question about hydrogen versus simply very good, efficient batteries. And one of the interesting things we did was visit the Holden motor car plant in Playford, South Australia. They'll be rolling out an all-electric car, not a hybrid, an all-electric car next year. And it'll be coming onto the market in large numbers. And that will simply operate by being able to plug into the normal electric grid, hopefully eventually renewable. So I think the key to the transport sector, and you're quite right, is very important, is to electrify as much ground transport as possible, and in the far-flung areas eventually go to biofuels, bio-aviation fuels, to power the airplanes.
Gentleman here with the black hair, he's next. If we could get a microphone to him. Thank you for following the guidelines too, by the way. They're standing up and saying your name, and it does help things quite a lot.
Good evening. My name's Simon Gillett. I've lived north of the river my entire life. I've read all of your books and reports. And my question, I'm sort of afraid from reading your books that we've starting to exhaust some of the planet's compensatory mechanisms. I know that the oceans can absorb a lot of carbon and a lot of heat. I know that in your book you mentioned the Gulf Stream is slowing down, and the permafrost is also melting and giving off carbon dioxide and ammonia. I'm sort of afraid that we may have reached the point of no return. Even if industry was to grind to a halt tomorrow, that carbon would still be released and temperatures would still go up. I want to know, do you think there's a magic number in parts per million that we need to stabilise carbon at? And have we in fact reached the point of no return?
Oh, that's a cheery question, but thanks, Simon.
I'm going to hand this question over to Will, but I just want to make two comments on two of the specific issues you raised that I wrote about. One was the melting of the permafrost, and I think in that article, the book, what I said was that the extra heat has the potential to melt the permafrost, but the warming also allows more vegetation to grow, and that vegetation can act as an insulating layer on the permafrost. So there is positive feedback loops and negative feedback loops, and it's unclear which one is going to gain the ascendancy over the short term, as I understand it, in that area. When it comes to the Gulf Stream, again, I just cited the modelling by the Hadley Centre for Climate Change Research, who estimated or projected that the chances of the Gulf Stream stopping were on the order of 5% this century. So not a high percentage of risk compared with some other risks, but something that probably needs to be considered. But Will, I think, is...
Yeah, very briefly, we use a so-called budget approach to answer your question. In other words, the Earth, or humanity, has a budget of about 700 billion tonnes of CO2 it can emit between now and 2050 and stay within that 2-degree guardrail that Leslie showed you. That roughly corresponds to about 450 ppm, if you want to think in those terms. We're pushing about 390, so we don't have a whole lot of wiggle room. If we manage to stay within there, the science is telling us today that those tipping points or tipping elements you're talking about will not be activated. In other words, we haven't hit the point of no return yet. We probably won't hit the point of no return at 2 degrees or less. But the more we go above 2 degrees, the probability that we're going to hit some of these tipping points rises very rapidly. And that's the scientific rationale for the 2-degree guardrail.
Thank you, Simon. A question here, this lady, if you'd like to stand up, I can see you with the jacket on and the scarf around your neck, then that would be lovely. Thank you. And then we come to this lady here in the second row.
Beth Schultz, resident of Netherlands for the last 40 years, and here is a grumpy old woman. First of all, I want to correct something that Tim said. Our colleagues our company, the Simcoa, that makes silicon, uses old-growth jarrah to produce its charcoal. We're not very happy about that. My question relates to population. Is the Commission addressing the question of human population and human overconsumption? because everything we do as individuals to reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions is completely negated when more people come to this country, whether by natural increase or by immigration. And let me say, I'm doing my utmost to persuade my children to have as few children as possible. 2, I'm down to 2.
Well done, Beth. Thanks.
Look, my understanding of Simcoe, and I didn't pursue this in any great detail, was they were using charcoal from forestry waste. And I didn't ask where it came from.
Depends on your definition of waste.
Okay, well, in any case, it's a fair enough comment, and I think that's something that needs to be thrown into the mix. But as I say, I wasn't privy to all of the details with that. In terms of population, really, you've got to look at this at a global level. Really, the population impacts are going to be felt globally. National borders are increasingly porous, no matter what we think or want. It's just the way in this globalising world, the flows of capital, the flows of people are becoming ever more rapid. And the global projections are that today there's about 7 billion people on the planet. By the middle of the century, that will have increased to about 9 billion, and we hope after that it will slowly starting to tail off. If you're concerned about population, then the big issue is really foreign aid. We need to increase the welfare of the poorest women on the planet, to increase their educational levels and increase their economic opportunity. We know that's what drives down family size. If we invest strongly in that, the UN projections are that population may peak at 8 billion rather than 9 billion. So that's basically the formula, I think, the way I see it.
Lady here in the second row. I should say woman in the second row. I can't assume you're a lady. I'm sure you are.
We won't go there. Thanks very much for your presentation. My name's Jenny Shaw and I'm a local. But I was really interested in knowing, given that the community understanding and uptake of climate change science seems to have waned recently, what ideas have you guys got to try and turn that around?
Mm-hmm. Good question. Thank you. Thanks, Jenny.
Sure. Well, one of the things we're doing is things like this. I think if one of our commissioners, Susanna Elliott, was here, who is an expert in science communication, she would say, as she did last night, that the so-called debate that we see in the media is not necessarily reflective of the true opinion of the broad community. The debate is a bit phony. It's drummed up by media who want to make a story sometimes when no story exists, because if everybody agrees, it's pretty dull. So I think one of the things we have to keep in perspective is the perception of the disagreement and the debate and the actual underlying real community feeling. And certainly what we've been finding as we've been going around doing these sorts of forums is that, by far the majority, 90+% of the audiences that we talk to and the people we talk to in community groups, even those people in businesses that will potentially be somewhat hurt by a carbon tax, are actually on board. They recognise that the science, even if they don't understand all its complexity, they recognise that something needs to be done. There's disagreement about the best economic approach to that. But I actually think that there's a lot more consensus about these sorts of things in the Australian population than is reflected sometimes by our politicians and by some of the more rabid media. So, but coming back to the crux of your question is what can we do, and it comes back to what Tim said earlier. I think, if you've got a real opinion and a passion for this, we'll talk to people, get informed, go to our website or the Academy of Sciences website or the CSIRO website, find out the information, talk to your friends, talk to your family, disseminate that information, get involved in local groups. There's lots and lots of climate change action groups, and I'm sure there's representatives here. The Australian Youth Climate Coalition, all sorts of local regional groups need you.
Yeah. In fact, Dr. Susanna Elliott made the point last night that there are lots of blogs on the net, of course, and everybody's entitled to your opinion. That's why we live in a democracy. Opinion doesn't necessarily mean peer-reviewed studies, and that was the thing that you needed to look at, whether it was published and peer-reviewed, as to whether it actually had credibility. Anyway.
Yeah, hi, I'm George Crisp. I'm a local resident, member of Doctors for the Environment.
And so I'm quite interested in some of the health aspects, and I was pleased to hear at least touched upon, because it's one of the things that's been largely overlooked from this debate. And I'd like to ask the panel if you think that actually the inclusion of health more, which people are genuinely sort of interested in, you know, in terms of their health and well-being, you know, should be included more in this conversation, because clearly climate change affects all of the determinants of our health, you know, in terms of, you know, clean air, water, food, you know, biodiversity effects, you know, medicines and diseases, you know, these things are really quite critical. And secondly, you know, the things that we're being sort of, I suppose, the things that we need to do to reduce our emissions are often things that have enormous health co-benefits, you know, active transport, you know, how we get our food, you know, not over-consuming. You know, there are many, many things.
Yeah.
And we can, you know, what part of the solution may be actually to sort of, we've externalised health, we've externalised climate change, has been described by Nicholas Stern as an externality. You know, if we actually bring these things into the, you know, the costing, you know, could we have health in all policies? Would that be part of the solution to addressing climate change?
Thank you, George, for that. I love that comment. Is there a drug for this? Couldn't we just fix it? Just buy a drug.
I'm really glad you raised the question of health, because one of the reports that we're hoping to put out, hopefully this year, is actually an impacts report on climate change and human health in Australia. The main author of that report will be Professor Tony McMichael, who is one of the world experts, and I'm sure you've heard of him. He's on our scientific advisory committee, and he will be the main author of that report. I think the health impacts of climate change are, as you say, underappreciated, even in a country like Australia. Let me give one example. We're all very aware of the 200 or so people that died in the Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria, and what most people are not aware of is that in the week before those fires, double that number of people died as a result of heat waves in Victoria and South Australia, about 400 people. And we don't hear about that sort of thing. But even in a country like Australia, with the great health system that we really do have compared to a developing country, there are significant health impacts of climate change, and they will increase. So watch this space. There will be a report, and hopefully that will bring this impact into greater appreciation.
Thank you. I've got another question that was put in earlier. It's basically because it's by somebody called Rafaela. Are you here, Rafa? I just wanted to say that name, really. Why is large-scale solar thermal not currently being utilised in Australia to generate clean electricity? Do you think, that's you, Professor Will Steffen?
Yeah, I'll go very quickly on that. The government's announced support through the Solar Flagship Project for 2 large solar stations. One of them is a large solar thermal station of about 250 megawatts up in Queensland near Chinchilla. And I think the really exciting thing about it is this is completely commercial size, 250 megs. But also it's using Australian technology, so-called Fresnel or trough technology, which will leapfrog Australia into the forefront of solar thermal technology. In fact, the rest of the world is quite excited about Australia taking a lead on this. A good example of an opportunity that if we grab it, we can really start generating an industry as well as generating our own electricity.
Great, thank you. Gentleman here with the glasses on the aisle.
My name's Bruce Robinson. I'm a convener of ASPO Australia, the Association for the Study of Peak Oil, and I just wanted to raise the other issue, the reverse side of the coin about resource depletion. Global oil supplies are likely to start declining very soon. I personally think we're going to be hit much sooner and much harder by oil shortages than by climate change, and I wondered, A, why peak oil is largely overlooked. We don't have a peak oil commission, for instance, and would it be useful to consider an integrated policy of both climate change and global oil shortages?
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you. It's good. And a question you submitted too, which is coming next.
Look, I think that's a fair enough comment, but as the Climate Commission, we really do have to restrict ourselves to climate-related issues. I think that's a good question to ask of any government, you know, or indeed any other body, but it's a little bit out of our purview to be able to deal with that.
Another quick comment. If Jerry Houston were here, and I've heard him answer this a lot, Jerry would say we're likely to hit peak demand of oil before we hit peak supply. And that's as we start transitioning our economies away from fossil fuels. You may see a surprising drop in demand for oil. So it's going to be a race, I think, between whether oil production runs out or whether oil demand drops first.
Oh. Lady just there with the hand up. You're next here if you'd like to. Alison, can you see just here in the cream?
Thank you. I'm Thelma Furlong from Cottesloe. My husband was on council when this beautiful building was being planned, But what can I say when we're travelling and I see plumes of emissions and he says, that's not CO2, that's just steam? What's the answer to that?
What are the emissions? If I could just ask, where are the plumes coming from?
Oh, from factories or whatever.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Well, boy, it's really hard to say unless you know what industrial process is going on under the smokestack. It's a bit hard to say.
Well, the one thing you can say is you don't see CO2.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it is colourless and it is odourless, but it's not weightless.
No.
That's right.
No.
Thank you, Will.
Yeah, no, that's right. Question here in the purple, if you'd like to stand, so it just makes it easier for Alison to see. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Beck Dow. I'm from Leeming. I was just wondering, with the fact that the Aboriginal culture has embraced the concept of working with the land for a long time, and now finally we've accepted it as a huge part of our culture and apologised, is there an environmental approach to incorporating aspects of the Aboriginal culture with science about working with climate change as opposed to just a fear campaign?
Interesting, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There is some work done, particularly in relation to Aboriginal fire management in Northern Australia. There's been some studies done by the CSIRO, for example, trying to estimate how much carbon you would sequester in landscapes by modifying fire regimes back towards more traditional Aboriginal means of burning the landscape. I don't have the figures at the top of my head, but you can look them up on the website. They deal particularly with Aboriginal-owned cattle stations. 11 stations were looked at across the territory. Their capacity to store carbon varied, but it was a significant amount. And if I recall correctly, with an estimated carbon price of $20, they were looking at estimated incomes for those communities on the order of $200 million, I think, for the stored carbon, potentially. But you can check the figures on the website. But there is indeed, at least at that level of fire management, an engagement with Aboriginal communities in the climate space. So.
And let me remind people too that the website is www.climatecommission.gov.au. There is a huge amount of information there, and also you can see other forums like this where, just on the off chance that your question doesn't get asked tonight, you may well see a response to that very question on the site when you look at some of the other ones. This lady here first, and then this gentleman.
Hello, my name is Barsha. I'm from Serpentine and I'm also a member of the Youth Climate Coalition. You talked about the Copenhagen Accord and the need and the fact that it isn't a binding agreement. I wanted to ask what your expectations were for Durban this year and whether we're going to see a binding agreement and whether countries will be able to agree to a target strong enough.
Look, a legally binding agreement means a treaty, yeah? And a global treaty has to include the US. And the fact of the matter is that in the United States, for a treaty to be ratified, it has to get a vote of 2/3 of the Senate, I believe it is, Will, which is 66 votes, which is just unfeasible for this sort of thing. That's one factor mitigating against a legally binding treaty. The last one we had in this space was the Kyoto Protocol, and it wasn't ratified by the United States. But you know, if you look at the impact of the protocol, Canada overran its carbon budget to a large extent, and will probably owe on the order of $1 billion Canadian at the end of the commitment period, at the end of 2012. So we've got a legally binding treaty, but do you think that Ban Ki-moon is going to send in the blue helmets to collect the $1 billion from Prime Minister Harper? I mean, I don't think it's going to happen. So, you know, when you think about it, what is important in terms of international agreements is pledges by countries, because their honour and their reputation goes with that pledge. So under the Copenhagen Accord, no one has pushed countries to set their own targets. They've been self-set, and those targets are being met by nations now. And I think that mechanism is at least as effective as a globally binding treaty. Sure, it's self-policed, but we've seen no signs so far of any of the countries reneging on their own self-set targets. The one problem with it is we don't have enough ambition yet. Under the Copenhagen Accord, we're getting about 2/3 of the reductions pledged that we actually need, so we need an extra third. Countries need to increase their ambition. We've already seen the start of that process with the United Kingdom increasing its ambition, but it'll be a long way. Now, at Durban, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. My suspicion is we'll see some more concrete rules around the Copenhagen Accord, we might see some progress on avoided deforestation, particularly in the tropics, and a focus on Africa, which so far has been a little bit out of view.
Gentleman here, thank you.
Yes, my name is Jean-Paul Orsini. I'm a local resident and also environmental scientist. I would like to ask the commissioners a simple question. There's a price on carbon, and that's going to have a cost for the Australian community, but it's also going to have opportunities, and in particular economic opportunities in terms of a new green economy. How long is it going to take for those costs to be offset by those new opportunities? Is there any modeling that's been done to basically tell us, is it going to be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years?
Thank you, great question.
Look, I'll do my best to answer that question, but I wish again Roger Beale or Jerry Houston were here because they do so much of a better job than I can with this. As I said, we don't give an opinion on policy, but we can describe basically what is suggested. And under the carbon tax, it's a revenue neutral scheme, so that all of the money that's raised under that carbon tax is put back into various initiatives, and they include some compensation for trade exposed industries. So that's important to understand. So if you're an alumina smelter, for example, you can easily be put out of business if an additional cost is put on you that isn't put on your competitors. So that is clear and agreed. But they've done it in a rather innovative way, and what they've said is we'll give you a certain amount of compensation, but if you reduce your emissions anyway, you don't have to give that money back. It's a bit like mum, giving you money for a school lunch and saying, here's $10 for your school lunch, but if you only spend $5, you can keep the extra $5. Sort of interesting. So it's incentivising change. There's also, of course, compensation for those people who will have to, for the people who, particularly where a large portion of their income goes to, say, energy costs, so the lower part of the economy. And those people will get compensation. I don't have the details with me, but I do believe it's the elimination of the lowest tax bracket is being suggested as the
Because people often say if too many people get compensation, what was the point?
That's right, yeah. So I can't answer the question of when the payback will happen within that, but it is, at least as it's stated at the moment, a revenue neutral scheme which will redeploy some of those funds into other areas. And I think the green, you're probably in a better position, Will, to talk about the Green Energy Bank, I think, but is that so?
Yeah, there's a number of packages here in addition to the money that's going to go back to industry and to households. Over half it's going to go back to households. But in addition, there's a green energy fund. There's two types. There's about $3.2 billion in a renewable energy fund. That's what's funding the solar flagships, plus other activities. And there's a $10 billion fund, which is in terms of loan guarantees, grants, and so on, to get all sorts of other types of innovative technology going, whether it's in transport, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in energy. So there's a comprehensive suite of packages. Just to give you an idea of how these systems work, the best analogy is a trading scheme that was used to bring sulfur out of smokestacks about 30 years ago, 20 years ago, in the acid rain issue. What they found there was the payback time that you asked about was much shorter than they thought, and the emissions were achieved at cheaper cost than they thought. So most of the modelling that you see is probably a conservative estimate, and given the creativity of humans and the known innovative and creative nature of Australian society, I'm really confident we'll crack this problem at lower cost than most people think and get the payback sooner than most of the economic models suggest.
Yes, Leslie? Yes.
Just to add something to that about innovation, Will and I were both at a conference about a month ago called Australia Over 4 Degrees, which was at the University of Melbourne, and it was a pretty depressing sort of conference talking about impacts, and two of the most depressing talks were Will's and my talk, actually. And we don't want to repeat them, but at the very last talk of the conference was a guy, they kept the good news stories to the end, just as we were all about to slash our wrists, and a guy stood up in the last talk and waved this thing in the air, this bit of plastic, and he said, "This is a solar cell." And he was talking about this new technology where you can actually now print solar cells on a printer, on a laser printer. And they're about 10% efficient now, which is a bit below what solar cell is on your roof, your hot water. But he said, by our goal is that by about 2013 or so, they'll be up to about 14 or 15% efficient, at which time it becomes competitive. And so these people are going to be producing solar cells that you'll be able to put on your roof on a laser printer. There's another company in the UK that are producing solar cells that are embedded in roof tiles. So instead of putting roof tile on and then putting, you know, those big things on top of that, you will just tile your roof with solar cells.
So for the innovative, there are going to be huge benefits.
There's, you know, I think the glimmer of hope, you know, a lot of us working in the climate change area get pretty depressed most of the time. But sometimes there's a glimmer of hope there in this fantastic new technology that, let's hope, will save the day. And hopefully the money being generated by these new schemes will, as Tim said, incentivise those innovations.
What will we do with the English language using words like incentivise?
I know, it's terrible. I don't even believe I just said that.
Dagger to my heart. Young man here has a question.
G'day, I'm Aidan. I'm the token boy in the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. My question kind of follows on a bit from that sort of, I guess, sense of climate depression. We've heard a lot about some of the technological or supply side things that we can look forward to in the future. What are some areas of industry in which we're not necessarily seeing as much promise, and how are we going to deal with the behaviour change that will be required in terms of consumers reducing their demand? Sorry for the economics question as well.
Yeah, you're lucky fellow. Token boy, it's good.
Yeah, you don't look like you're suffering, by the way.
Yeah. Wow. Well, look, I am. It's a really good question, and I must say everywhere we've looked, we've seen some innovation. Steel making is a particularly hard one for Australia because we've got a lot of capital sunk in traditional processes in terms of steel making. And they emit a large amount of carbon because they need coking coal to be put in to reduce the oxygen off the iron and make the steel. But there are other approaches to that being trialled overseas. So as an example, hydrogen from natural gas is used in some parts of the world, particularly I think India and Middle East. In Brazil, charcoal is used as a reductant, and there's a different process which allows steel to be made using charcoal. And the Koreans have a program on at the moment which might eclipse all of that, which is about using hydrogen from nuclear reactors as a reductant. So there you've got effectively a carbon neutral steel. But these things, we don't know how far they're going to be off. Are they 1 decade, 2 decades, 3 decades off? We just don't know. That's the nature of innovation in this space. So it's a really hard question to answer. And all I can say is that as commissioners, I think we've seen progress in most of these areas. A lot of the problem we see actually is caused by the cheap price of energy in the past. And the Holden plant was a great example of that, where 10 years ago or so they'd made a big paint shop, which is very central to their business. But at that point, the price of electricity was low and they didn't see it rising, and so it's rather wasteful in the way it uses electricity. It's not terribly efficient. So those sort of sunk costs, when it's only happened 10 years ago, are really hard for a business to come to terms with. So, I think sending that long, clear message to business where there's certainty around the regulation in the long term so they can plan their investments in the long term is really critical to innovation and change in those areas.
And one of the things too, as much as our commissioners are talking about the critical decade too, doesn't mean that it all stops, that we stop debating the issue by 2020. It's the beginning of it. It's the beginning of the discussion. So it certainly will be going on. Gentlemen here, 3 in, would like the microphone.
Simon Dawkins. I run the Oil Mallee Association with 1,000 farmers which grow trees throughout Western Australia, and we're very pleased and hope with the CFI, and we hope it goes through very soon. But one of the things I'm curious about is the international mechanisms. The example you gave of the charcoal in Brazil was a CDM methodology, Clean Development Mechanism, and it was financed by First World Investment. And I think there's enormous potential in those investment flowing to where the cost of abatement is lowest. In your role with the Copenhagen Commission, given that the Kyoto period is coming to a close, was there good discussion about the same mechanisms like JI or CDM in that future?
Thank you, Simon.
Look, it is the hot topic at the moment, I think, in the international negotiations. What do we do with the Kyoto period coming to an end? How do we carry on some of those very useful mechanisms into whatever the new agreement will be? And there's no easy solutions to that sort of stuff. It's really tough because the Kyoto Protocol bound the developed nations, but not the developing ones. There's a lot of politics around the whole thing. I don't know, Will or Leslie, if you're close to any of that, but it is tough. And we hope they'll be carried through, but there's no certainty around any of this.
Yeah, I'll just make one comment. One of the considerations of the multi-party committee when it went through the process of designing the package, which is now being discussed and debated, was this idea of linkage to other schemes so that you could get trading across borders. And the scheme is explicitly designed both in the starting price and in the architecture of the permit system to be linked to the European ETS, to the Californian ETS when it comes in, first of all to the New Zealand one, perhaps to the South Korean one which is coming in, and to get a global network of developed countries which can then trade. We get experience in trading and verification of emission reductions in other countries, and then extend that to the developing world. So I think it's a case of we want to start walking before we run, which is why we have a 3-year fixed price period. Then we want to start running and running hard, grabbing hands with our partners around the world, and then doing exactly what you say. So there's been a lot of careful design into that package to make it compatible with other schemes around the world.
Just briefly, Professor Leslie Hughes, you mentioned before in your graph up there that there was more rain falling in the northwest and further inland away from the coast. Why don't we just move the crops there? I mean, if that's where the rain's going to be, why don't we go there and along with the rain?
Well, we could do that. It probably wouldn't work. The soils are not particularly good to support agriculture. The terrain is pretty rugged. And from an ecological perspective, as a conservationist, you know, we've already pretty well stuffed up the southwest, so let's not go and stuff up the northwest as well. So that would be my personal perspective. There is certainly more attention being given to the Kimberley for agriculture. You know, from a purely biodiversity perspective, I hope that that doesn't happen. But certainly what climate change will be doing is forcing a lot of different ways of doing agriculture in particular. And Australian farmers are pretty adaptable. They've had to be. But I think over not just talking about Western Australia, but over the whole continent, what we're going to be seeing increasingly is that a lot of dry land will become even more marginal than it is now. We're going to see farmers moving off properties, as indeed we are already seeing in places like the Murray-Darling.
18,000 went off 2 years ago. 18,000 in 1 year.
Yeah. But we're also seeing rather deliberate adaptation. So, for example, Brown Brothers, which is a big wine-growing company, are buying up big in Tasmania, and they're moving their crops, their vineyards to Tasmania because they recognise that that's where they'll be able to grow wine in the future. You know, I'm thinking Tasmania's going to get really crowded because everybody's going to go and want to live there.
It's good
I
because
know
it's
quite
really
a lot
cold,
of
so they'll be close.
CSIRO scientists building houses down there, actually. But the point is that agriculture in a country like this is fairly adaptable, and we're going to be having to do a lot of adaptation.
Lovely, thank you.
Could I just point
yes.
To add, the Northern Task Force, I think about 2 years ago, completed a study of Northern Australia that sort of answers your question. And really, when you look at the volume of good quality soil in Northern Australia, it's nowhere near what's in Southern Australia. So the soil resource is one of the major limiting factors.
Lovely, thank you. Sir.
Thank you, Verity, and maybe this leads into that. I wanted to ask the panel, I guess, an ethics question around climate change, which means theoretically everyone could input into it. And to make it a bit more specific, rather than asking a general ethics, what do you think the ethics of climate change are, maybe a focus question, what would you say to the position that when a price on carbon arrives, some people might see that as them discharging their responsibility. I pay for my more expensive power. What would you say to that position around the moral aspects of it?
Great question.
My name's Rob Weymouth and I'm from over that way.
Well, I think we can all perhaps have a bit of a go at it. But
look, I don't think most people will react that way. I mean, I posed that question to my daughter, who's a student, and said, look, Sonia, if your price is going to go up in your house and you and your mates are going to have to pay more, but the government's going to give you enough money to pay for that. What are you going to do? And the first thing she said was, we're going to reduce electricity and then use the money for something we really want to do. So people will actually react in ways that are more creative than just using the money to pay for that. Also, ethically, I actually think when Leslie shows this slide that she showed, a lot of people actually relate to that. And despite all the hoo-ha in the media about what's this going to cost me in my pocketbook today, almost everyone we talk to actually cares about what happens to their kids and what happens to their grandkids. And again, to talk about what Leslie's done in previous forums, one of the biggest applauses we got was when she talked in Port Macquarie about what this means for other creatures on the planet and the rate of extinction going up. Most people actually relate to the wonderful diversity of life around us. It's part of being a human. It's part of being on this planet. So I actually think underneath it, yes, we are concerned about making a living today. We have to be. But underneath that, I think there's a strong feeling in everybody about the next generations of humans and then broadening that out. So I'm optimistic that these ethical things, although we don't talk about them about as much as we should, are actually still there, and we should talk more about them. I agree with you.
Leslie?
I was asked on ABC breakfast television yesterday morning. It was very early in the morning and I was a bit bleary-eyed. It was prior to going to a business breakfast yesterday that we did with the Minerals Council. And a reporter asked me, and she was trying to stir me up, I suppose, saying, well, you know, you're going to go and talk to all these miners. You know, that's going to be tough. How are they going to take all this climate change stuff? And my response to that was, well, you know, miners have kids too. You know, business people have kids too. That's the ethics of it, really. Similarly, this morning at our business breakfast in Bunbury, we had a bit of a Q&A session, and there was a guy in the corner who worked for BHP Billiton, and he gave the sort of the party line, you know, the carbon tax is going to hurt our company and we're very exposed and all that sort of stuff. We thought, oh yeah, you know, what else would he say? But then after the breakfast, he came up to me, and he'd been to the forum the night before, and he'd seen that kid, the grandkid slide that I show, and he said, oh look, I really related to that actually. You know, I said what the company expects me to say, but I'm worried about my kids. So, you know, I think in a way it's a very human issue. You know, it's not just about economics. It gets discussed as being about economics all the time in the media. But it's really about human life.
Absolutely.
You know, I think the issue is sort of forcing a maturity on humanity that might not have occurred as quickly otherwise, because this is a truly global problem. I mean, you know, the CO2 we put out today is going to be over another country in a couple of weeks' time. The atmosphere mixes very readily. And it's forcing the development of a new kind of politics. And we see through the struggles we've had at Copenhagen and the other meetings how difficult that birth is, you know, to create some sort of global response. Because every time we do that, we have to give away a little bit of power. It's like forming a federation. Each of the states has to give away something to gain the benefits of being part of a larger whole. And that's now happening at the global level. And when I look at the young people who are involved with this, like people like the AYCC, for them, they live in a different world to us. For them, the boundaries, the national boundaries are not as important. I mean, I'm old enough that when I wanted to understand the world, I picked up my old atlas that was in my house, and all of the nations were there in different colours, you know, in the world map, and the British Empire was in pink, and you could see it going across. These kids today, if they want to understand the world, they go straight to Google Earth, and there is a real-life image of the Earth without the national boundaries and, you know, this sort of stuff. You can actually see the living planet. And in some ways, that embodies the world that I think is going to emerge out of this challenge. It's going to be a much more globalised one where humanity is united to the extent that it can deal with these global problems, whether it be overfishing of the ocean, blue water oceans, or regulating the atmospheric gaseous composition of the atmosphere, or whatever. And that's going to be a really interesting challenge. So at a moral level, I think we're taking the first tiny baby steps towards what is a really profound change, actually, for humanity.
Well, we've already had some great solutions. George deciding that we should all get out and cycle. Somebody else here, I think it said it too, which is great. Reducing. We know that we should reduce our electrical use in our household. Who just got their bill, by the way? Yeah. Did you notice how much it had gone up? I thought, that's it. All of this is going off in that. Does anybody have anything that they want to say that they think is a great idea for a solution, a simple solution people can go away with, apart from some of the really, amazing, isn't it? Some of the times the most obvious things are the things we don't do.
Price, long-term resident. I'm just really interested in urban agriculture, and I think there's a lot to be gained there, and I'm interested in new models of governance which help us get things done, and with, you know, clear goals which we've got now. We know we have to produce food and water, and, you know, and we have to keep costs down, and we've got, you know, good ways of working together. And, you know, let's start getting more production in the cities so we don't have to bring things in.
Less wastage in our own households. Thank
Sorry,
you very
that
much.
wasn't a question.
Lady here, and then...
Hi, my name's Sandy Chambers. I'm also with the Youth Climate Coalition. I think a really great way is to support young people because we'll be sort of obviously the future policymakers. And something that everyone in this room could do is talk to all your young relatives or friends and get them to come along to PowerShift, which is coming to Perth the first time in September. And it's a 3-day youth climate summit. And it's just going to be educating and empowering young people to stand up for our future in the new climate. So
thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Your parents already think they support you, by the way. And final comment from this lady in the red just in the aisle. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Shani Graham and I live in Hulbert Street in South Fremantle. And just commenting on your urban food production, I haven't bought vegetables for 3 years now. I live on a 213 square metre block. And if you want to come and see some of the things that we're doing in Hulbert Street along a lot of the things that you were talking about. And one of the things we've discovered is, as well as food production, how important community is. And actually how much you can change what you need as far as electricity and entertainment and all sorts of things if you actually really embed within your community. So I'd like to invite everyone to come along. No, not in bed. Verity, come on.
You're close to your community.
Oh, someone behind me is telling me that I should also mention a fantastic program that I'm involved with called Be Living Smart or Living Smart, and that's being offered here fairly soon. Also the Earth Carers in this area are fantastic ways that people can actually not just find out what they can do individually, but also engage more with their community around these issues. Because it's great to go to conferences and hear those things, but you actually get a real buzz out of actually doing something.
Thank you, Shanti. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our time, but let me tell you that our commissioners will be gathering, so afterwards, outside for at least half an hour, I think, with some light refreshments. Come up. Talk to them, especially if you didn't get a chance. I hope that we got to a lot of the questions here tonight. Let me remind you too about the Climate Commission's website. Go and have a look at it, www.climatecommission.gov.au. Will you please thank our 3 climate commissioners, Professor Will Steffen, Professor Leslie Hughes, Professor Tim Flannery.